In this session, I'll talk to you about adapting a UI design, specifically from a PSD, a Photoshop file. And it's going to be a bit challenging technically, but really cool, because we're going to do something as amazing as the image you see on your right here. And this is the original, that's the Photoshop design. That's not what we'll end up with. We'll end up with something that looks very similar, although not pixel perfect, because I'm not aiming at that. I'm aiming at something that looks more device-like, and I'm not going to copy the fonts or the icons. I'm going to use material icons because they're available, and I don't want to go into that. If I wanted to do it pixel perfect, I could, but you know, getting 95% is much easier than getting that last 99%, and every bit you add beyond that complicates things further. So I want to keep this relatively simple. It's still going to be a bit difficult. This design is something I got from that envisionapp.com/do URL you see at the bottom here. Check it out over there. You can also download the Photoshop file, the specific Photoshop file I took it from. That includes several designs. I picked just one specific screen to make things simple for this specific demo. So let's look a bit deeper. This specific image will first break it down into the images that we need. And the first steps that we need to do is to cut out pieces out of the design that we'll need to use. In this specific design, there isn't that much to cut out because it's a relatively simple design, and which is part of what I like, and also because a lot of these things are standard, so we can use the standard elements. Like I said before, we won't need the icons. In this case, if we were building something that's pixel perfect, I'd also cut them out, but we won't be using them. We'll just use standard icons that we have. And we'll need the background image. We'll cut it out and we'll put it in the title area, of course. We'll use the standard FAB, floating action button, from Codename 1. And it's and we'll just configure the colors to look like that. That's the only change that we need because it's already implemented in Codename 1 and will just work. We will need another single image, so that makes 2 images in total that we'll need from that Photoshop file. And that is the image pointed at here, the green line at the left, including the selection itself. And we'll cut these as a 9-piece border. I'll discuss 9-piece borders a bit later in case you're not familiar with that concept, but generally it just allows us to scale design or specific types of designs like this one in a way that's very efficient and doesn't degrade the image quality in any way. So they're pretty useful for things like this in terms of design elements. And those are the only 2 images that we'll need. As I said, we'll ignore the icons for the checkboxes as well. So I'll use the standard material checkbox, which looks slightly different than this, but very close. Obviously the magnifier and the back look a bit different as well. Still, it will end up looking really nice in my not so humble opinion in this particular case. So in the first part, we'll open Photoshop. Now, I don't know if you have a Photoshop license or not. You would probably want to have Photoshop, although I provide the cut images if you don't have it. I think it's definitely worth to have it. You can do most of these things with GIMP or other free tools, but as a fan of GIMP from the past who eventually took the plunge into Photoshop, it's much easier when you're working with a designer that produces a Photoshop file. Similarly, Sketch, the same thing, although I have less experience with that, so I don't want to get into that at the moment. So this is the PSD. It includes a lot of images, as you can see. I'm zooming in, and I'll pick the right one back. Yeah. So this is it. I'll just try and crop it, so we'll just have that because I don't care about everything else. And I want to cut out the relevant image files, the shop at the top, and without all the text and the FAB and everything else, just the image of the sandwich. Just the sandwich, that's good enough as it is. It actually does look good. And the trick to cutting it is I'm converting it to a smart object. That's an option in Photoshop here. You need to click on the right area there and it converts. Then double click that and it opens it, and that's it. That's the image. And that's really convenient. Now notice I'm using export to export as a JPEG and reducing the quality a bit. And that removes all sorts of metadata that Photoshop might include inside there, which is really annoying and took me ages to find out. So instead of doing save as like most people do, like I used to do export. Big tip, huge difference in terms of file size. And the reason I'm using JPEG and saving it is because we'll use the image as is, and we won't use all sorts of how should I put it, multi-images or anything. We'll use the image just as is because it fits in that sense. We'll scale it anywhere on the device, and it will work in that way better. It'll keep the size of the resulting app smaller. Now I'm hiding the elements, the text and the checkbox, and now I can just select the area that matters, and I'll do a copy merged. Now copy merged is copies just the visible pixels. Unlike a regular copy, Control C or Command C won't work in Photoshop. You need copy merged. And then when I create new, it automatically sees the size of the clipboard and uses that. So I don't even need to set the size. That's pretty great UX there. So I just type in the name, although I didn't need to, and I can just paste it in. And that's the image that I need, and I can just save it. In this case, it's okay to save, although I could do an export there as well. It doesn't matter though, because I'm going to cut it into a 9-piece border, and Codename 1 will regenerate the image anyway, so the way I save it doesn't really matter in terms of metadata. It's discarded anyway. So that's Photoshop, and these are just the two images we need. Now other things that we'll do here is picking colors and things like that. I won't show them to you. It's just using the color picker tool and things like that. I'll just type in the values for the specific colors when we'll get there. And let's skip right ahead to the interesting part, which is the code. So one of the important things in the code, and I want to talk about that a bit more in depth, is the floating action button. Now, the area at the top that you see here, that's a toolbar. And I could cheat by essentially not having, one of the tricks that I did in the past is just not having a title at all, and then drawing the entire area on the top using just components that I add into that area. And that would work, and that would work great. And I have shipping apps that work like that, but I want to use the toolbar, at least to some degree. But I'm not using it in the same way as most apps use the toolbar. And the reason is this specific floating action button. So it resides in the area between the toolbar and the content. Now, the floating action button is positioned in a special area in Codename 1 called the layered pane. Now, the layered pane is a layer that resides on top of the content pane, which is, the content pane is where all of the content of the form, the whole body, resides. And the layered pane resides on top of that visually. So whatever you put in the layered pane will appear on top of whatever's in the form, except for the title bar or the toolbar in that sense. They're separate. And the reason we decided to put the layered pane on top of the content pane and not on top of everything is partially historic and in retrospect possibly wrong. Although it does have advantages. It does have the advantage of the common use case, like things like validation, things like that are mostly relevant for the content pane. But In retrospect, it would have been useful to have the ability to place things also on top of the toolbar, but we don't have that other than the glass pane. And specifically, before I digress too much, the layered pane doesn't have that. So we literally can't put a component like that between the toolbar and the form. So there's a trick. And the trick is that the toolbar can be drawn in essentially on top of the content. And the use case for that is, in some cases, content needs to slide below the toolbar for various effects, including this specific effect. That's exactly one of the use cases that we built this feature for. It's kind of a hidden feature. You need to construct the toolbar with a true constructor, and you need to install it manually instead of the global toolbar settings. So we'll use that in code, and we'll show you how to disable the global toolbar, which you can disable temporarily or permanently, whichever. We'll just not set it to true in the init method, and then just install the type of toolbar that you need. The thing is, when you have an overlay toolbar of this type, the content will hide underneath that toolbar. So we'll need a special component to push the content downwards. So the portion with the image, so it won't hide the apple, the what is it, bananas and everything that we need to buy. So it won't hide that. We'll add another invisible component that's exactly the size of that image, and it's going to reside below that image, and it will push the rest of the things downwards, and that sort of solves that problem. And the floating action button can just be positioned wherever, because the toolbar is now part of the parent form and it all works as expected. And that's why some of the things that I'm doing in terms of the code will look, how shall we put it, weird. There's another reason, and I'm keeping that to the end, of the specific design choices I've made. I made the code not necessarily in the standard way, and I'm keeping that as a secret to the finishing slides. So the next thing I want to talk about is the checkboxes. Now, you can customize checkboxes in Codename 1 to look exactly like that. You can do that. I don't like to. It's possible, but the moment you start customizing checkboxes, you do that in a global API, because there's lots of assumptions inside the checkbox code that expect it to behave in a particular way. And this is a really, really, really simple thing. So the thing is, in Codename 1, we have special modes for checkbox and radio buttons that allow them to render without the actual check sign. Now, that doesn't sound like what we're doing here, but that's exactly what I'm doing here. I'm turning on the toggle button mode, which effectively hides the check mark from the checkbox. And then this icon that you'll see here is really just an icon of a check. And these are really toggle buttons, they're not checkboxes. So it's really easy to do a checkbox with a toggle button, which is technically a checkbox. Perhaps I didn't explain that in the best way. So checkboxes can essentially be toggle buttons, and toggle buttons are just buttons that are either pressed or released, and they don't have a check next to them. So in this case, these are literally buttons that are checked or released, and the difference, the V sign next to them is really just an icon. It's not really the standard checkbox component. And the reason I chose to work in this particular way is it's just a bit simpler to customize. That's pretty much the only reason to do that. Otherwise, customizing the checkbox, it's some APIs that aren't convenient. So let's start by creating a new project, and I'll create a simple bare bones application. Almost every project that I create is just a standard bare bones application with nothing in it, so I can add it myself. I use the native theme, and it's important to define a correct package name at this stage. If you don't know that by now, don't use codename 1 for your names, please. I see lots of people do that. Please don't do that. That's not a good idea, because this package names must be unique and must be owned by you. The domain must be owned by you. That's crucial because that's something that you'll use to ship your app later. So don't screw that piece up, because that's really bad. And it's creating a new project, and it's just the standard typical bare bones codename 1 project, nothing in there. And here we go, regular form. So now let's paste the shopping list in here and move on to actually creating the right form with the right name for the form and the right title for the form. So it's a shopping list application. And I'll start with building the individual checkboxes and separators from that string array I pasted above. But this is currently, everything is hard-coded for simplicity's sake. It's not an actual application yet. So I need to import, obviously, these component and checkbox and all of that, and NetBeans is a bit acting up in terms of everything I have running concurrently on my machine. So forgive me about that. The checkbox, I'm creating it with a string constructor, and I need to do several things in order for the checkbox to appear as it is in the design. And one of those things is to set the gap. The gap determines the distance between the icon and the text. So I need to set the gap to 3 millimeters so that it will look similar to the design, where everything is spaced out. And notice I also need to place the text to the right of the icon using the set text position, and that will place it so it looks that way. Otherwise the text will be below the icon, and it's not the design UI that we actually want. Now notice that the design uses a lot of spacing. One of the things I see developers do incorrectly is sort of ignore the spacing, or automatically set margin and padding to 0 everywhere, and that's not good. You need to use white space and notice it really well in the designs. White space is super important when it comes to design, so pay attention to that and try to use it effectively so designs will look good. And of course, last but not least, we're adding the icon itself. That's a font image, so it's literally a font icon from the built-in material design fonts. So I'm just using a material font with a UI ID, and the UI ID will be used to get the design, the colors and the size. Sorry, in this case not the size, because I'm passing the size as the last argument, but the colors, foreground, background, opacity of actually transparency, but nuance. I'm giving it that UI ID. That way I can customize that UI ID later on in the designer tool, which we'll move to right after this, and set the correct colors. I'm using separate icons for the icon and the pressed icon, so each one would look a bit different. I'm obviously giving different UI IDs, although it's technically the same icon if you look at it. And that's essentially the checkbox. The next stage is the separator. The separator is actually a really cool thing. It's just a label that literally does nothing other than have a specific UI ID of separator. The thing is that I need to invoke a special method here. And that method indicates that I want the label to render, despite the fact that it's empty. Because there's a special case for empty labels that hides them. And this sort of disables that special case, because it's very common to use labels and have them disappear if I don't want them. So that's the default. So you need to call show even if blank to do that. And I will just do a for loop over the elements within the shopping list and just add them one by one. And I'm just adding them all to the shopping list, add, create check, and then add the separator to separate it to the next line. And I'm doing it as a single statement mostly to signify that it is a single statement logically, if not physically. And next we'll move to the designer. And in the designer tool, I'll add elements first for the checkbox, the checked icon. So it will have the right color. And I have it in my clipboard here, that's specifically the selected color, and I'll keep it transparent. Then I'll copy that and I'll create an unchecked icon. And the color there is pretty easy to remember. It's just a form of gray. And the transparency, again, same thing. We don't want a background for that. And last but not least is separator. Separator is pretty easy. Because toggle button first. So in the case of the toggle button, we have again the specific background colors. Not as easy to remember, but not too hard. And one of the things that we need to do with the toggle button, besides define the transparency to opaque in this particular case, is to disable the border, because toggle button is a standard component and has a border by default. So I need to select an empty border to override the built-in default border for toggle button. Next, I need to define a lot of padding, so it will feel spacious. Again, back to the original design and the importance of using padding to make user interface feel wide. And I'm setting the margin to 0 because they need to literally touch one another. I'm also explicitly setting the alignment to left because the default alignment for buttons is often center. And I'm setting the font to be thin font at a specific millimeter size, and that will, I experimented with it and it looked reasonably good. Now I'm using the native fonts which don't look identical everywhere, and I'm pasting it to the different stages. Now, and here the last stage, and this is really important, I pasted the toggle button to the selected, and I left it as is. It's not necessarily what I'd want to do, but I did it right now. Might change it in the future. But the press state, which is the one we're looking at, is when a toggle button is physically pressed down. And in this case, I want the 9-piece border that I mentioned earlier. So before we go into doing that, I want to have a word about what 9-piece borders are, in case you aren't familiar with them enough, haven't played with them, didn't read that developer guide section about them, which I worked really hard on writing. So take that passive aggressive and use that to study that section again. And if it's not great or excellent, please edit it on the wiki. So 9-piece border essentially it's great for symmetric shapes, although it works with some asymmetric shapes. You will notice the shapes on the left are colored in green. Those are great shapes, or good shapes in the case of the rightmost one. For 9-piece borders, they will work with 9-piece borders. The shapes on the right will not. And the reason will become apparent when I explain more accurately why. It's also harder to work with some types of gradients with 9-piece borders. The advantages that 9-piece borders have is that they're efficient, and they're low memory, and they don't degrade. When you scale them to infinity, they look essentially the same. And the reason is the way that they work. So a 9-piece border cuts an image into these 9 pieces that you see before of you. The 4 corners, 4 sides, and the center. And what